Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Killaby Center for Recovery and the Radical Recovery Summit. And I'm here today with Mark Wolynn. He is an expert on inherited family trauma. And we met a couple of years ago at the Science and Non-Duality Conference. And I attended his workshop. I've read his book. And Mark, you've been at the leading edge of research and understanding on how families affect addiction and how trauma is generated through families. And maybe you could start by talking about your work.
Inherited family trauma, this is the field I accidentally fell into many years ago. And I see myself as the guy with the flashlight, shining it on the symptoms and behaviors that we can't explain. And my work is about helping both clinicians and non-clinicians to recognize the importance of generational trauma and its biological effects on, subsequent generations. I've developed a way of looking at trauma language, both verbal and nonverbal, which we can get into more, but helping us become detectives of this unconscious language, this trauma language that explains the mysteries that we live with, the unexplained fears, the anxieties that strike suddenly, the depressions that we never get to the bottom of. We may carry the symptoms, but often they don't originate with us. Like the title of the book, it didn't start with us. These symptoms could be the residues of trauma in our family history that we've biologically inherited from parents and grandparents.
So when somebody has an understanding of their family history, how does that help? Like I have some answers to that, but I'd love to hear your answers to that. How does that help us to know that this is passed down through families and how knowing our history is helpful?
Well, the first thing it does is it eases us to know that we're not aberrant. Many times we think we're just wired this way, that, oh yeah, this is just how I am. I freak out whenever I hear loud noises, or I, it's very helpful to be able to, again, be that detective, to follow this trauma language or these trauma patterns or the non-verbal elements, our symptom picture, and be able to see where it originates, because it eases. It isn't how we heal. That's just the first step. But it eases, many of us are walking around with a sentence, I deserve to die, or I'm a terrible person, or I'll harm a child. And when we realize that the origin of these fears, these behaviors, these sentences, this language doesn't begin with us, it begins to ease something inside of us. Because for a long time we just felt we were wired in this way. Let's say our parents or our grandparents, they lost a mother or a father when they were young, or they were sent away or placed in an orphanage, or one of their siblings died tragically. Maybe dad was walked with his little brother to the lake, and the little boy falls through the ice or drowns, and the father's only 7, but he blames himself. And that feeling of, it's my fault, I'm a bad person, I didn't save my brother, that language travels, that trauma, that fear, that experience travels forward in the generations. In other words, the trauma doesn't necessarily stop with the people who experienced it. The feelings, the sensations, specifically the stress response, can be passed down to children and grandchildren and expressed in trauma language. And we now have biological evidence for this.
Mm-hmm.
So, but the healing itself, that happens through having an experience powerful enough to change the brain, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that was really helpful for me, and I didn't hear this from my mother, I heard it from her brother, my uncle, was that her mother had been sexually assaulted when she was in high school. And I always wondered why my mom was the way she was. Very cold, contained. We never had the talk about sex. She didn't want to hear about it. And it's, it was the 1950s and she was a housewife and she didn't want to be. And there was a whole bunch of other things going on, of course. But it made so much sense to me when I knew that. It made her behavior seem less personal to me, made it seem like less of a rejection of me than something that was going on with her. And I could really see how that had come through the generations from her mom to her and to us. So I think it is really important that we know what our history is. It
Yeah,
helps to normalize it or something.
yeah. I remember the very first case that taught me how to look for inherited family trauma. And this was people weren't talking about generational trauma 30 years ago, and it was a time when I was working with a lot of self-injurers. And this one particular self-injurer, a cutter, she was a 24-year-old woman, had come to me with a behavior, and we couldn't locate it. She was cutting in an extreme way, in fact, so deeply that she would hit a vein or an artery and almost bleed to death. And it didn't make any sense. Most of the other cutters I'd been working with were making more superficial cuts in their body to have some type of control or to release some type of anxiety. But this particular woman, I'll call her Sarah for this talk, Sarah would almost bleed to death, and her parents would find her bleeding, and they'd rush her to a hospital, and they'd put her in a psych ward. They'd stop the bleeding and then put her in a psych ward for 3 to 4 weeks at a time. And my question, I was working with her at the time, why is this? What was going on? What was trying to be communicated here in the way Sarah cut? And so one day after she was released, I handed her a pen and I said, "Here, Sarah, pretend this is your knife and show me exactly what happens when you cut." And I wanted to follow what I could observe as a somatic therapist. And so she placed the pen to represent her knife at her arm. And all of a sudden I saw her eyes begin to glaze over, and, she starts to dissociate. And I said, "Right there, what's that thought? What's that feeling? What's that impulse right there?" And Lynn, she turned to me and said, "I don't deserve to live." And here I am. I'm looking at a 24-year-old woman whose life has just begun. And I remember saying, "Sarah, what have you done? What did you do? Did you harm somebody? Did you take somebody's life accidentally? Did you cause an accident? Did you break up with somebody?" And she said, "No, nothing like that." And back then I knew nothing about intergenerational trauma. So we looked in her childhood. I figured it had to be something with her relationship with her parents. And she actually had this warm and loving and connective relationship with both her mother and her father. She was able to receive their love and nurturance. And so I figured it had to be an attachment. So we start to look early in, the birth experience and the gestation, the pregnancy. And no, she had a safe, strong, secure attachment with her mother. So luckily, I asked her, I said, "Tell me about your grandparents." And boom, she dropped the bomb. And I thank goodness I asked this question. But, her grandmother was an alcoholic. She had been driving the car drunk. Grandpa was in the passenger seat. She hit into a telephone pole. She lived. But grandpa went through the glass and got cut, lacerated on the glass, and bled to death before the ambulance arrived. And in that minute, the whole story was told. It was like, why she was almost bleeding to death, the non-verbal trauma language, why she cut so deeply, and why she almost bled to death every time she cut. And the verbal trauma language, which wasn't hers, which was, "I don't deserve to live, I deserve to die," which was her grandmother's feeling for taking the life of another person, particularly taking the life of her beloved. And I knew exactly what to do because I was a student of psychodrama at this time. I put 2 chairs out in the middle of the floor and said, close your eyes. There's your grandfather who she'd never met and your grandmother who she'd never met. And see them there on the floor and tell your grandfather what you do. And with her eyes closed, she says, Grandpa, I cut myself. I go, tell him how deeply. She says, I cut myself so deeply I nearly bleed to death. And I said, tell him like you did, Grandpa, like you did, Grandpa. And I said, what's he showing you? What's he telling you? And her eyes are closed and she's having this experience that will be significant enough to change her brain. She's having this experience. She goes, he doesn't want me to do this. He's telling me that every time I go to cut myself to feel him there supporting me, holding me, protecting me. And so I said, okay, look at your grandmother. Tell her what you just told me, that you don't deserve to live. Grandma, I feel that I don't deserve to live. Tell her what you now learn. Grandma, that's how you would have felt. And what she's showing you, she's saying the same thing, that every time I feel like I don't deserve to live, to see that as hers and to breathe that feeling toward her, and she'll be there to hold me and protect me. Well, she goes home, does these 2 things, never cuts again. And, what was interesting, Lynn, is I had her father come in to the session as well, because, he's the key here. Traumas pass forward when there's not been any resolution, when there's been a stuckness, a pushing away of something, a rejection. And of course, he rejected it, pushed away his mom for taking his dad's life. He blamed her for the death of his father and couldn't love her anymore because he was so enraged. And she died an alcoholic when he was about 20, and his father died when he was about 12. And he couldn't grieve the father either, because every time he would try to grieve his father, his rage toward his mother would come up, or he'd have to think of the gruesome images of his father's deaths. Both of these things would block the grief. So with the father in my office, I had Sarah sitting over on a couch watching. I did the same thing. And I asked the father this key question: why? And of course, this is a source of addiction, a lot of addiction. Why did your why did your mother drink? What happened behind her? And it was right there. Oh, she was given up to foster care. She was given away to foster care when she was 3. Her mother, the father died, the mother had no money, puts her daughter in foster care for like a year or 2. And I went, oh, of course. And I looked at him and I said, he's sitting next to me. I go, of course she drank. The dopamine is missing, the relationship with her mother, the break in the attachment. She's looking for safety, security. It's not there. She's, the reward motivation circuitry is looking for dopamine. It's not there. The light went on, right? He goes, oh, of course she drank, right? She has no mother. And at that moment, he was able to forgive her, love her, open his heart to her, and grieve his father, which I had him do right there in this session while Sarah's watching. But the cool thing that happened was what he did after the session. He stands up, looks over at Sarah and says, you leave this with me. I've got this. And this is the key in intergenerational trauma.
Yeah.
And why we suffer is the events of the previous generations are left unhealed. They're not talked about.
Right.
The story, there's family secrets. The stories aren't told. The grief hasn't healed all the way. People don't want to talk about what's painful. We want to push away what's uncomfortable. And when we do that, of course, we create fertile ground for reliving, for repetition. So, yeah.
Wow, that's a powerful story, isn't it? Wow.
Well, I wanted to tell it because you asked me how I got into this earlier in the preamble before we started recording, and it is the story. It's the session that changes my life, and then after that, of course, I meet Bert Hellinger, the great father of constellations, and I begin to learn his work. I'm one of the early North Americaners who learn this work and bring it to North America, to Canada, and the United States.
It was a shock to the father and to Sarah to see that. So she wouldn't have been consciously aware that that was what was going on until you started asking her those questions and working with her in that way. And
Exactly.
he wouldn't have seen it either.
No. He's angry at his mother for being an alcoholic, for killing his dad. And he's blocked his love and healing of the grief and healing of those relationships. And because what remains on, I have a simple way to explain repetition. Whatever we push away continues. Whatever we exclude, whatever we reject, whatever we don't want to feel, repeats, persists. As we know, what we resist persists. So here in this life, in this family, what couldn't be felt, what couldn't be experienced, what couldn't be healed, passed forward again to the next generation, and would have gone further if we didn't do our work with Sarah, because what we know is this it continues. It's a three generation plus link, and this is what the latest research tells us. We can, it tells us that we can be born into these feelings. As infants, we don't, enter the world with a clean hard drive. There's to use a computer analogy, there's an operating system already in place, one that contains the fallout of our parents' traumas, our grandparents' traumas, their experiences. And we're born with fears and feelings that don't always belong to us. And, the question, why is this? What happens in trauma? If it's okay, I wouldn't mind explaining to the listeners here what happens, the science, what happens. I think I'll just do it, huh?
And that was going to be my next question, too. Yeah, go for it.
I figured as much, but I might as well just go right into it. When a trauma happens, it changes us. It really does change us. Literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA. And this changes the way our genes function, sometimes for generations. Technically, a chemical tag, an epigenetic tag, will attach to the DNA after this thing happens. And it will tell our cells to use or ignore certain genes, enabling us to better deal with this thing that just happened, this trauma. And then the way our genes are affected will change how we act or feel. In other words, we'll become more sensitive or more reactive to situations that are similar to the original trauma, even if that original trauma occurred in a past generation, so that we have a chance of surviving it in this generation. For example, if our grandparents came from a war-torn country, there's people being shot, there's bombs going off, there's uniformed men lining people up in the square, people being taken away, we never see them again, the grief is insurmountable. Our grandparents would develop epigenetically a skill set which they would pass forward. The skill set would be, let's say, sharper reflexes or quicker reaction times, reactions to this violence to help them survive this trauma, which is going to pass down, which is ultimately going to help us survive this trauma. But the problem is, we can also inherit, we do inherit, a stress response, often with the dials set to 10, prepared for this war, this catastrophe that never arrives when we're born in the suburbs. And we rarely make the link that our anxiety, our hypervigilance, our depression, our shutdown is connected to our parents and grandparents, like Sarah and her father. We just think we're wired this way. What I was saying in the beginning, we're walking around thinking, this is how I am. I just feel terrified when I see policemen in uniform. Going back to the grandparents seeing soldiers in uniform, or when I hear loud noises, going back to the previous generations with bombs and bullets. And these gene changes, as we're now learning, these are what's transmitted to our children and then to our children's children. And, I could go on and on about the science. I'll just say maybe a couple things. Rachel Yehuda, we all know who she is. She's the person who works with the Holocaust survivors and finds out that it's not just the survivors, but it's their children that are having the same trauma symptoms as the Holocaust survivors. The children are having the same trauma symptoms. And then she's finding the same physiologic mechanisms, specifically the low levels of cortisol, the stress hormone that gets us back to normal after a stressful event. And she's also the one who does that study with the children of the World Trade Center that are mothers who were pregnant at the World Trade Center when the buildings were brought down. Their children, if the mothers went on to have PTSD, their children went on to have PTSD. Here's a sentence she tells us that you and I are 3 times more likely to have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder if one of our parents had PTSD. And as a result, we're more likely to struggle with anxiety and depression. And these patterns, they can be observed in humans for 2 generations. That's because it takes 12 to 20 years to get a generation in humans, which is why we've gone to mice and rats. Why we look at, when working with mice, you can get a generation in 12 to 20 weeks. But what's more significant is mice have a similar genetic makeup as humans. Over 90, 92, 93% of the genes in humans have counterparts in mice, with over 80% being identical. And you can see when little mice are traumatized, the effects can be physiologically, biologically, molecularly observed for 3 generations. There's this one study at Emory Medical University, Emory Medical School in Atlanta, where they take male mice and make them afraid of this cherry blossom-like scent. Every time the scent goes into the cage, they shock the little mice. And they already find epigenetic changes right in that first generation. Their brains grew. There were enlarged areas where a greater amount of smell receptors lived in their brains. So the mice could detect the scent at lesser concentrations. They could protect themselves because I can smell it more quickly. I can go into a bracing response or a stress response. So their brains had epigenetically adapted to protect them. So the researchers had an idea. What if we take some of that sperm, because they could notice the change in the blood, the sperm, and the brain. They took the sperm, they injected it into female mice who weren't shocked. And these female mice became impregnated with the mice of the shocked male mice. And the amazing thing is what happened in the 2nd and 3rd generations. The offspring, it became jumpy and jittery just by smelling the smell. They had inherited the stress response without directly experiencing the trauma.
That's incredible that they can see that in a lab, because it really makes a lot of sense. Like, our nervous system, our brains are always trying to protect us. So what's happening in our stress response is never random. It always makes sense, right? And so to be able to have better smell receptors, that completely makes sense. So one of the things I hear people talking about with intergenerational trauma is, if you're in utero and your mom has a lot of stress or anxiety, or there's some kind of fear or trauma, then you're just awash in the adrenaline and cortisol and all of the stress hormones.
Totally.
And then she's probably not as able to have a secure attachment with you. So then you're feeling disconnected. She is. And so you can see how in our bodies and nervous systems and hormonally and chemically it happens. And then what I'm really interested in, though, is this piece around a specific traumatic event also being tagged somehow. So when you were talking about Sarah, it's like, I don't deserve to live, and she's cutting herself so deeply. What's your thinking on how that gets passed along?
Brilliant. Yeah, yeah. Good. Thank you. That's a great question. I talk a lot about this idea of trauma language, but how does it get formed? So, not only when a trauma happens, we're changed chemically, molecularly. I've discovered that when a trauma happens, clues are left behind in the form of emotionally charged words and sentences that form a breadcrumb trail. And if we learn how to follow this breadcrumb trail, it's like finding the missing piece of the puzzle, which allows the whole picture to come into view and can finally give us this context for, why we feel the way we feel. And it's essential we learn to listen to this trauma language because, as we know from trauma theory, when a traumatic event happens, significant information bypasses the frontal lobes. So the experience of exactly what happens in the trauma, it can't be named or ordered through words because our language centers get compromised. And then without language, our experiences are stored as fragments, fragments of memory, fragments of body sensations, fragments of images, fragments of language, which I focus on a lot, the fragments of language, fragments of emotion, even fragments of memory. For example, you talked about your mom's sister having a sexual trauma. Her children might have the same feelings, like they could have been traumatized sexually, and it's not their trauma, but they have the images, the memories, the sentences, the language. It's like in a trauma, the mind disperses, Lynn, and essential elements, they get separated. We lose the story of the trauma. Mm-hmm. We either remember too much or remember too little, and then we never complete the healing. Yet, what I've learned, what I've discovered, these pieces aren't lost. They've simply been rerouted, and they resurface in our verbal and our nonverbal trauma language. Again, verbal language is, like Sarah said, I don't deserve to live, which is not her language. But the nonverbal trauma language, we look for it in our physical or emotional symptoms that show up after an unsettling event. We look for it in our fears, in our anxieties that strike suddenly maybe even when we reach a particular age, Lynn. Maybe age 30 is the age that grandma becomes a widow, and she never has any other partner. And then mom and dad divorce when they're 30. And then all of a sudden we look at our partner at 30 and we go, yeah, I don't know why, but I don't feel anything. Mm-hmm. We're never connecting that age 30 is this triggering event. It's not just ages. It's, I can get into that later when we talk about what are some of the signs of inherited trauma. But I want to first talk about this idea of nonverbal trauma language. So an age, or there's a depression or a destructive behavior, a self-sabotaging behavior, or we go back into a binge, an eating binge, a drinking binge, a drug binge, after a situation that's similar to some trauma in our family history, perhaps even the trauma you were talking about, an attachment trauma that occurred in utero when our mom's dad died, or our mom and dad were fighting, or our mom didn't get enough juice from her mother and can't give us enough dopamine, enough juice, because she didn't get enough. So this similar event happens that's adorned with loss. And all of a sudden, our behaviors start to become enacted. This nonverbal trauma language, it's also mirrored in our relationship struggles, who we choose, how we're treated, the partners that we choose that treat us terribly. And we keep doing that because it's similar to the trauma that lives in our DNA, or the repeated ways that we deal with money or success. We shoot ourselves in the foot. We self-sabotage every time we have, because we're not able to keep what we have because perhaps we lost it in utero. Every time we don't have our mother's shining light of attunement, we don't believe we're going to have it, and we don't believe that we can keep it. So often we repeat patterns of not being able to have. I often say is the mom is the template for abundance, having enough and getting enough. And when we didn't have enough or get enough, often we don't have enough and don't get enough because we continue the trauma pattern. So all of this forms a breadcrumb trail that we have to learn how to follow.
Right, right. So one thing that I know from my work on myself and with other people as well is that if we have sensations or energy in our body, that trauma is stored in those along with associated memories. And so what you're saying here is that they might not just be our memories, they might be from generations past as well.
Oh, I'm so absolutely saying that.
Right.
These remnants of memory that we think, this is the main key. We think we're wired a certain way. We think it's us. And we just walk around thinking, well, this is how I am. No, not necessarily. Because, these intergenerational experiences affect us and they live in our bodies. They live in our cells, really, in the way our DNA expresses as behaviors and feelings and sensations and adaptive behaviors that
Right.
that
Right.
exist because of this trauma.
Resmaa Menakem wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands. Are you familiar with that book?
I'm not.
It's a beautiful book, and it's about racialized trauma. And he's a somatic experiencing practitioner and a therapist, and he's a Black man, and he has a real something that was kind of new to me anyway, way of talking about white people blowing their trauma through Black bodies. And he
Oh,
talks about the Middle Ages in Europe and the brutality of white people to other white people. And how, because we haven't resolved that we have this stored in our systems, and then it comes out in all kinds of really horrible ways.
yeah, I love it. I love that. White people blowing their traumas into Black bodies. Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Look, we're all children, and children express what's unresolved between the parents or what's unresolved behind the parents. And as children, our children also mirror to us as parents what we felt at their age, but we have long ago pushed away, we've long ago suppressed it. And here again, we're those children born with just what we're talking about here: fears, feelings, symptoms, rage, anger, unexpressed healing that didn't always start with us. And we know hurt people hurt people,
Yeah, we do, unfortunately. Yeah,
don't we?
yeah. So if you start working with someone, do you mostly work with families or do you work with individuals?
I mostly work with individuals. Now with COVID, I was the guy that before COVID, I was the guy that used to travel around the world, on all the most continents, and lead trainings in inherited family trauma or do family constellation workshops. Now I work, I give online trainings, or have online trainings that people can purchase, and or I work one-on-one with individuals.
So people could get on your waiting list to work privately with you, but they could also take some of your trainings.
Absolutely, or they can work with someone who's trained by me. I have some really good people as well.
Mm.
Yes.
So what would somebody kind of expect? I know it's all individual, but what's the general kind of beginning steps of starting to look into inherited family trauma for somebody?
Yeah. So again, sorry to go back to my book, but I do that. I'm going back to my book for a reason, because it's three parts really. In the first part of the book, I teach us how to be detectives of our trauma language. How to hear and listen to and watch our symptoms, behaviors, and the words we say. One of those questions you'll remember from the book, I asked what is your worst fear? If the worst thing happened to you, if things went terribly wrong, if things suddenly fell apart, I find the answer to that so potent. And it can tell us whether we carry generational language, or attachment language. For example, if our language is, I'll be abandoned, rejected, left, given away, I'll be alone, I won't exist, I won't matter, I'll be annihilated. This is all attachment language. And then there's another stream of language that is generational language. I'll harm somebody, I'll hurt a child, I'll go crazy, I'll be locked up, I'll do something terrible, I'll be hated. This type of language makes us look back in the generations. So then the next part of the book, we do the traumagram, the genogram. And we've gathered the language in the first part, we've linked it in the second part, and then the third part of the book is how we heal. We have to have images and experiences potent enough to change the brain, and then we have to practice the sensations and the feelings of these positive experiences, so we can change our brains. And I feel like I'm just the bearer of bad news. I tell that we all are in the same boat, and the boat's sinking. But there's a lot of good news coming out there right now. Researchers are able to reverse trauma symptoms in mice. That sounds small, but it's because they're little. But it's so not small, because it's how we heal. When traumatized mice are exposed to positive experiences, it changes the way the DNA expresses. So they take the same mice, that guy that made the mice fear the cherry blossom scent, Brian Diaz, the same researcher, he taught the mice not to fear it by repeatedly exposing the mice to the scent, but not shocking them. And then these mice no longer showed the heightened sensitivity to the smell, to the scent. And what was more important is their sperm lost that fearful epigenetic signature that could pass forward to future generations. Technically, the positive experiences inhibit the enzymes that cause DNA methylation and histone modifications, which are two of the mechanisms of transgeneral epigenetic inheritance. The third large one is microRNAs, small non-coding RNAs. What we know from science is that RNA, just regular RNA, is copied from DNA, and it acts as a messenger to instruct the cell's ribosomes to produce specific proteins. But cells also contain these small non-coding RNAs that don't produce proteins, Lynn, and they piggyback onto the messenger RNAs, causing more or less of these proteins to be produced, affecting which genes get actively expressed. And so now what's happening is there's all this positive research out there where you place mice in positive, low-stress environments, and their trauma symptoms reverse, their behaviors improve. There's changes in DNA methylation or to small non-coding RNAs, which prevent the symptoms from being transmitted to the next generation. One of the researchers right now, Isabelle Monsuy, out of the Brain Research Institute in Zurich, the University of Zurich, is doing some amazing work with both mice and humans. She's looking at the humans that have been traumatized by remember that terrible event in Nice where that guy drove the van on the promenade and killed 80 people? Yeah. She's looking at the survivors of this 2015 terror attack in Nice, and she's finding correlations in the blood of traumatized mice, and the same as in the blood of humans. She's also looking at the blood samples from Pakistani orphans that have lost their parents, who've experienced similar chaotic early years in their lives, similar to the mice that have been separated from their mothers in labs. And she's finding similar small non-coding RNA alterations, basically similar biomarkers in mice and in children. Why this is significant is because how we heal is by having positive experiences that can change our brain. And I talked about this earlier. I'll go a little bit more in depth right here because you were talking about sensations in the body, learning to be with the sensations of trauma, and then how we were talking about how we even have sensations that aren't from our experiences. It doesn't matter whether they're our traumas or whether we've inherited the stress responses which cause these sensations in our bodies. We need to have positive experiences that can change our brain, and then practice the new feelings and sensations associated with these experiences, these positive experiences, because that changes our, not just allows us to create new neural pathways, but it allows us to stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters in our brain that we need, like serotonin and dopamine and GABA, and feel-good hormones like estrogen and oxytocin, even the very genes involved in the body's stress response. We can change those too. They can begin to function in a new, improved way. Basically, we can change how our DNA expresses. And these positive experiences, can be practices of receiving comfort or support, like Sarah. Remember Sarah, now when she goes to cut or feel that she deserves to die, she's going to feel her grandparents, who she's never met, around her, giving her support or comfort. But it can also be practicing having feelings of compassion, practicing having a gratitude practice, which we know is important, or having a generosity practice, or a loving kindness practice, practicing mindfulness, as we know, ultimately anything that allows us to feel strength or peace or joy or wholeness inside our bodies, because it's these types of experiences that allow us to feed the prefrontal cortex and help us reframe the stress response so it has a chance to downregulate, chance to calm down.
Right. So that really gives us a lot of hope for healing. So somebody who had a pretty tough time as a child, maybe had abuse or neglect, and because of alcoholism or mental illness or whatever the reason. So maybe they get together with someone who's really consistent and reliable and steady and who they feel really safe with. And then
even if that person is our adult self, right? Even if that person who's consistent and stable is the adult part of us that is holding these young fragmented parts. Look, the idea is to pull traction away from the limbic brain, the limbic system, the overactive amygdala, in a nutshell, and bring engagement to the forebrain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, where we can integrate what's positive and our brains can change. If I were to put it in a nutshell, we need to practice being with what's uncomfortable in our body, the uncomfortable sensations, until we can reach what's beneath them, the sensations we experience as life-giving, sensations like pulsing, tingling, expanding, softening, my blood's flowing, waves of energy, warmth, and practice being with these positive sensations, and then be able to hold this experience being with something positive like warmth, expanding, space, being able to hold it for at least a minute, and then do that 6 times a day. So 6 times a day, being with positive experiences, that can be enough to change the brain. That can be enough to calm our stress response. So the key is, reminding ourselves to take time for positive experiences and let these sensations of these experiences affect us viscerally, physically. Trust the feeling of it in our body.
Right, right. And so if we were to tie this into addiction, what would you say about that?
Yeah. Well, so addiction, there's the main source, our mothers didn't receive enough attunement from their mothers, or something happened to them in utero. They were stressed. The baby before died. and they thought we would die too. The pregnancy was, mom was spotting or almost ejecting the pregnancy, and she was terrified we wouldn't live, or she would lose the pregnancy, or she and dad are separating, or she and dad are fighting, or someone's cheating, someone's drinking, someone's threatening violence, or there's violence happening. So as we talked about, cortisol, adrenaline, the womb, we're being barraged with this experience of terror. Mom's fear is our fear. Mom's terror is our terror. Something's wrong, mom feels. Something's wrong with me. With the message is, and the child yearns for that feeling of security that's missing, because it was missing in utero, or it was missing in our early childhood. So that's, for me, addiction dynamic number one. Mom either didn't get enough to give it, or something happened in utero or when we were little, so there wasn't enough safety and security. And so we yearn for this feeling of goodness, which we get in a drug or addiction. Another dynamic for me in my work is fathers who are missing or rejected or perceived as losers in the family, or disliked by the mother. And the child unconsciously continues the rejected behavior, or the rejected, a good way to turn our child into a drinker is to say, don't you dare drink like your father. Mm-hmm. It's almost a prescription for saying, because the child will find a subterranean way, and a subterranean connection, an unconscious connection with his father, if the father's rejected. So that's a second dynamic. Another dynamic is if our parents are alcoholics, a child continues it. Another dynamic is, a parent died young. And so our child unconsciously attempts to follow the dead parent through drugs or alcohol. Mm-hmm. If you couldn't live fully, mom, if you couldn't live fully, dad, I won't live fully. So yeah, a mother's stress in utero is number one. Mm-hmm. Because it impedes her ability to attune to her child. But there's those other dynamics we need to look at as well.
So one thing as you're speaking about this that I'm kind of wondering about is, it's pretty well known that children develop core deficiency beliefs because they take the blame on when there's insecure attachment, or there's something going on and they can't fix it. They feel that there's something wrong with themselves. So when you said about, well, mom, if you can't live your full life, I'm not going to live mine either. Is that a similar dynamic, or what's going on there?
In my work, we call it unconscious loyalty. That we need both parents, even if our parents were horrific, and didn't know how to love, and didn't know how to tend to our needs, and were violent. Still, even in our inner levels, even in our inner work, we have to feel the force or the receiving, even in an internal level, if we can't do it on the outside, of, mom, dad, I know you couldn't give it to me in the outside, but here in my inner levels, I take, and I take it in. When we don't do that, part of us attaches to what's negative. It's almost, we have this, we could go on and on about the brain and the negativity bias, but there's another element too. We seem to join with what's negative. We seem to merge with what's negative, what's rejected, what's pushed away. So if our dad is the bad guy, part of us becomes the bad guy. Mm-hmm. If our mom is the bad gal, part of us becomes the bad gal. We sort of hook in to, as a way of joining. It's almost a way, this loyalty of saying, dad, you cheated on mom. I won't let you be the bad guy alone. I'll cheat too. Mm-hmm. Mom, you gave away your child. I'll abort my first child. Mm-hmm. Mom, you gave children away. I'll give children away. Mom, you couldn't, you had a bad relationship where you were mistreated by dad. I'll have a bad relationship where I'll be mistreated by my husband. These unconscious loyalties, they don't make sense, but they exist in a subterranean level where we will bond with what's negative in that parent. So I always say to the parents, please talk nicely about the other parent, support the other parent in your child, because the more the other parent is excluded, the more that child will find an unconscious way of joining that parent through what's negative.
So the common divorce, bitterness, parents turning against each other, step families. Do you feel like this intergenerational, this inherited family trauma comes through step parents as well? Or is it always genetic?
No, it's genetics. We're talking about inherited DNA expression, inherited gene expression. But step parents can cause trauma. They certainly can. They can mentor and be powerful figures or traumatic figures. But yeah, in that sense, it causes trauma, but it's not heritable trauma.
I wanted to get into they get your book, which is a really good place to start. They do the genogram and they go, wow, I have a lot of mental illness on aunts and uncles and grandparents, or I have addiction or something like that, or I have the inability to really feel and connect with people. What would you say are a couple of steps then? You've talked about some of them, like really focusing on positive experiences to heal, but do you have kind of a few things that you want to leave people with?
I do. First of all, we have to follow the trail. Unfortunately, we have to, follow the trail of our behaviors, and because there's these triggers. We get married, that could be a trigger. Everything goes great, and all of a sudden, getting married takes us into a deep feeling of being trapped, because maybe our grandmothers were given away in arranged marriages as children, or we moved to a new place, and all of a sudden, hey, I just moved across the block, but I'm depressed, and all of a sudden, it's bringing up a trauma of our ancestors that were persecuted or forced out of their homeland. So or we get rejected by our partner, and even if we were with a partner a short time, we feel like I'll never get over this, because it takes us back to an earlier trauma, a break in the attachment with our mom in utero. And we have to follow the trail of trauma language. That's one, because if we don't follow that trail, we don't know how to separate what comes from us and what comes from the previous generations. But then we've got to talk about the traumas in our family history to our children, and we have to complete the healing. We have to go into the pain, as we know, and grieve. A lot of times that grief is blocked. We have to grieve and heal. And word of advice, please don't exclude anybody. Please don't reject anybody, no matter how great the pain, no matter how great the behavior, how terrible. We've got to resolve these things, because if we don't, aspects of these traumas show up in later generations, and unconsciously we'll repeat the pattern, or our kids will, or their kids will, or share a similar unhappiness with us, until that trauma finally has a chance to heal. Freud observed this 100 years ago when he looked at repetition compulsion, that the contraction of the trauma is looking for its expansion. It's looking for a better outcome, so we can heal, and the traumas will repeat until there's an opportunity for this better outcome. I believe that the contraction of a trauma is ultimately looking for its expansion, and that's why these repetitions keep happening. That's why these traumas keep repeating. Shake the family tree, see what falls out.
Well, and I think it's so hopeful that when we actually turn towards it and we feel it, it doesn't kill us like we thought maybe it would. And that's how we start to really heal. And I love what you say too about talk to your children about it.
Because they don't know.
Don't know.
Because parents believe, if I seal my lips,
Mhm.
Don't talk about what happened to me. I'm immunizing my children. No, you're doing the opposite. We need
Right.
to talk because if we don't work through the traumas or talk about them, then they have a tendency to pass down. Uh, our children have no clue as to what's happening. Look. If we ignore the past, we know this. It comes back to haunt us. But when we explore it, we don't have to repeat it. We can break these destructive patterns. I always say biological inheritance, it may be a reality,
Mhm.
uh, but it doesn't have to be our destiny. We can change our brain.
It's inspiring to think that our own healing can go down through the generations and heal. I didn't have enough healing when my son was young to do what I wish I could have done for him. And, I've done enough healing now that I have a really different relationship with him as well as with my grandchildren. And so that can be an inspiring thing to say, I don't want to pass this along, even though it might be, we might have our adult children are kind of out of the house, they're adults now. But there's still all of that healing that can happen between the generations. And I don't want my children and grandchildren to have this suffering. So that can make this work feel really worthwhile too.
Oh, yeah. And even our 30, our 20, 30, 40, 50-year-old children, we look them in the eyes and we tell them what happened. We take their hands and we say, when you were little, you can't remember this because your hippocampus hadn't formed connections to the prefrontal cortex at this point, obviously. But here's what was going on. So our children have a hook on which to hang this coat they wear.
Mm. Hmm.
Yeah,
How important that is.
yeah,
Yeah. And so if someone is stuck in denial or shame or disconnection, then they're not going to be able to do that.
yeah, yeah. It's so important.
Mhm.
We do our work. We know this. We know this. We know this. We know this. Do your work. Do your work.
Mm.
Open your heart. Have a compassion practice. Have a gratitude practice. Have a generosity practice. Practice the sensations of these good feelings.
Mhm.
In my work, I from the book I teach how we can have comfort and support, and then to practice the feelings of comfort and support. But it's not the only way. There's so many ways to um, take in something good from giving to someone else, from feeling, a tongue Lynn practice of
Mhm.
breathing out, of good feelings. There's so much we can do.
Mhm. So do you find that when people do this work that they end up feeling compassion for parents, grandparents, other people who've hurt them?
It is the goal of this work. You see, many people will come to me with not a bone of compassion for the mother that hurt them or the father that hurt them.
Right.
And that's how they come. They have no compassion for what happened to those parents when they were small. So I always open the back door. It's like, let's look back there and let's do the traumagram. Let's do the genogram and see what made your mom unfeeling, what made your dad violent. And we look at some of, in that part of my book where we do the core descriptors, we talk about the parents and, the core complaint and those 12 questions. And, it's an important winding process. And I think I do it well in the book is to take somebody from no compassion or no willingness to work with those parents, because I've thrown those parents. We have spiritual parents now. I just, heal with the great mother and but those parents, I've tossed them. So I believe that in the book that, I can help people get to the other side of that to compassion. Yeah.
Right. And that we're strong enough to do that.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Hmm. So how can people get a hold of you? Let's talk about that. And you have some
Oh,
things that people can do online as well, and certainly your book. So
yeah.
let's give people those resources.
Yeah, okay. My book, It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. It won the 2016 Nautilus Award in Psychology. But it's also in 19 different languages, 20 now. We just got Greek. So 20 different languages. If English isn't your first language.
Mhm.
And my website is markwolynn, WOLYNN.com. And I just completed a great training, which is available on demand. Um, and I do advanced classes online, and I have a waiting list, but either I or one of my students can work with you.
Right. And that would all be online now. People could work with you online,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful thing that's happened this year, is that we have so much more access to people
Yeah.
and online trainings, but also working online individually as well and in groups.
See,
Yeah.
that's a good reframe. That's a really good reframe, Lynn. We're in the midst of this pandemic, but it is really positive, all the availability
Yeah.
of wisdom and knowledge that, yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
Yeah.
good,
Yep.
it's a good
Finding.
way to see it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mark. It's been
Oh,
lovely talking with you. And I'm really glad that you could come here and work with us on this. This is a really important thing to understand and to integrate and assimilate into our life.
oh, thank you for having me, Lynn. I really enjoyed our talk, and I'm grateful to be part of the conference here.